From the Sky News Centre, this is Paul Murray Live.
G'day mate, happy Thursday wherever you happen to be. It occurred to me today that no matter how you vote, Labor kind of gets whatever it wants. What am I talking about? I was thinking about this today about Bill Shorten back in 2019. Now, he was odds on with all of the political people, but we all know why he didn't become Prime Minister. But what were his key ideas that he took to an election that were rejected by the Australian people? Well, he was going to block the Stage 3 tax cuts. He was going to introduce new rules on negative gearing and franking credits. He also was going to place a 45% emissions target on the economy going into 2030. But we all know Australia rejected each and every one of those big ideas. Gone, see you later. Now, you would think that after they had been as soundly rejected as they were, that they would be dead, buried and cremated, like all of the things Liberal parties have to say are dead, buried and cremated every time that they lose an election. And then, of course, we got the current Prime Minister as the new leader of the Labor Party. And his path to the Prime Ministership, apart from promising serious changes when it came to cost of living, that literally everything would be cheaper under a Labor government, well, he in fact got rid of the negative gearing policy. He backed the Stage 3 tax cuts. He said that a 45% emissions target was a mistake. And of course, Australians believing that the things they had rejected in 2019 were also going to be rejected in 2022. In part, they elected the current Prime Minister. But as we all know, this current Prime Minister, of course, was able to pretend that a 43% reduction in emissions targets was different than the 45% that was a mistake a couple of years earlier. Now, of course, the reason he was able to say he didn't have Bill Shorten's policy was because it was 2% less. And 3 years later, oh, and apparently it was going to save you money.
Reducing power prices by $275.
By 2025, $275 a year.
$275 a year.
We'll get power prices down by $275 a year.
And on top of all of this, apparently the expectation was that there would be 600,000 new jobs that would fall from the sky between now and when your power bills are apparently going down next year. Well, okay. So the whole point was it was still Shorten's policy, it just was sold in a different way. But we were told that it was the mistake in 2019 to go after the changes to the tax system. And as we know, the Prime Minister ended up changing them anyway to the Bill Shorten position. So the Bill Shorten position that we rejected on an emissions target has now been repeated by this government. Their position when it comes to changes in taxes has been introduced by the government who promised not to do so. And now, of course, negative gearing. With the conversation coming from the crossbench and the media who like to cheer these things on are that the one idea that still is waiting to come from the Bill Shorten playbook that was rejected, the Bill Shorten playbook that was referred to as a mistake, but now they're in power and they assume no one's getting them out of power, they'll just potentially introduce it anyway. And we know why. Because the current Treasurer, despite saying at the last election, no changes to negative gearing, was saying this when he was selling Bill Shorten's policy. So we know that 2 out of 3 of Bill Shorten's policies became the law of the land regardless of the fact that we rejected them. Is it going to be 3 out of 3? Well, what do you reckon the chances are that the Treasurer will be able to act on how he's always felt about negative gearing?
But any housing policy that doesn't deal with negative gearing and capital gains tax is a sham. Housing affordability, which doesn't make important and considered changes to capital gains and negative gearing, has a hole in the middle of it. If you want to deal with housing affordability, you need to start with negative gearing and capital gains.
And despite the fact that he is getting ready to implement what he has always believed but was rejected from the Australian people, then hid from the Australian people, what a surprise that right now is when the puffy profile pieces of Jim Chalmers, potential future leader, are starting to pop up in the newspapers, including that one over summer, remember, where he admitted to being a little bit loose when he was on the cans in Parliament, but who would ever investigate exactly what that was about? So the lesson for all of us to learn here is that regardless of how you vote, and regardless of which Labor person hates the other Labor person and then will walk away from the Labor person when they eventually become the leader, we still get the policies that we rejected at an election. So you should just remember this next time they say, absolutely, we're not going there, we've learnt our lessons from last time. No, they just wait till they get in and then they assume they're so awesome that you won't remember. Now, a little more on the negative gearing thing, where the Greens are deciding to particularly highlight that the Prime Minister has got a couple of investment properties, and therefore that's the reason why he's not going to move on negative gearing.
If Labor wants to deal with housing affordability, then it's time to phase out the billions of dollars in tax concessions property investors get every year in the form of negative gearing and capital gains tax concessions. A lot of renters are going to start asking the question, why do we have a Labor government with a property investor as a Prime Minister who is fighting to protect negative gearing and capital gains tax concessions in the middle of the worst housing crisis we've seen in generations?
Now, all of this is to do with the politics that we have spoken of in the past, which is that the Greens, which have always been the stable source of preferences for the Labor Party, so they can say whatever they want, they'll have less vote than us, so we'll always be able to pretend we won't be that too far to the left, but we're guaranteed to get the support from the left wing when it comes to the Greens. But as the last federal election showed, that there has been a surge in the vote for the Greens in areas that mean they end up getting 1, 2 or several hundred more votes than the Labor Party, and then it's Labor preferences that get Greens elected. And also, the politics here is that currently, on most opinion polls, best case scenario, 14, maybe 15% of the vote. But 30% of Australians are renting. The Greens are desperately trying to gin up support amongst renters, that they become the party of renters. And if they can turn 15 into 16 or into 17%, well, then guess how many Labor seats start to fall to the Greens, and the Greens start to take over as the power players of Australian politics. But the last part of what that bloke just had to say just got me thinking about the property investing Prime Minister. And this was the bloke who was going to be protecting negative gearing. Well, they were very specific in the choice of that bloke to be the one who was speaking. Because when you have a look at his interests listed on the Parliament House website, he doesn't own a house. But we've had a look at all of the other Greens to tell you whether they don't just own a house, but they too are property investing politicians that presumably are using the system of negative gearing like most people who invest in property. Now, they can come out and release a financial statement or tell us that we're wrong, but the following Greens politicians have got investment properties, like this one. The member for Ryan, Elizabeth Watson-Brown. Well, she doesn't just have a house. She's got an investment property, 50% funded by her, 50% by her partner, and she's got a holiday flat, again, 50% owned by her and 50% by her partner. Are either of those being rented out? Well, I would presume so. If so, if they're running at a loss, guess what happens? Negative gearing kicks in. Then, of course, there's Senator Nick McKim from Tasmania. You see, he lives in a house. He owns a shack in regional Tasmania. And then he's got not one, but 2 investment properties that presumably he too is getting a rental return from. Then there is Senator Penny Alleman-Payne. I'd never heard of her either, but she's from Queensland. Well, guess what? She has got a house in Gladstone in Queensland, and she's got an investment property, which is her former house, that presumably is being rented out. If not, I apologise. But it's listed in her pecuniary interest as an investment, something potentially she could be renting out, and if the rent isn't as much as the mortgage, negative gearing kicks in. And then one more time, can we play the comments of the Green who's trying to get you to believe that everyone in the Greens don't own houses, they're all renters, and the evil problem when it comes to protecting negative gearing is the Prime Minister because he owns some investment properties?
If Labor wants to deal with housing affordability, then it's time to phase out the billions of dollars in tax concessions property investors get every year in the form of negative gearing and capital gains tax concessions. A lot of renters are going to start asking the question, why do we have a Labor government with a property investor as a Prime Minister who is fighting to protect negative gearing and capital gains tax concessions in the middle of the worst housing crisis we've seen in generations?
Well, funnily enough, there's another Greens MP. This is a senator. No doubt I'll be accused of racism for even mentioning what is freely available in the public documentation of Nigel Farage. Remember, this was her pictured at a protest in Sydney with someone suggesting that the best place for the Jews to go was in the bin. Oh, but she deleted it, right? Well, she, of course, has a house. She has an investment property and a second investment property, one in Sydney and one in Port Macquarie. She's also got some land in Pakistan, but that's not relevant here. She has two investment properties. So my point is that the Greens are going to try to present themselves to the renters of Australia as people who are not at all involved in the scam of negative gearing. Yet, as I've just shown you, senator after senator after senator and an MP has got not one but two investment properties. Now, does this mean that these people have to sell their properties? No, but it just means you have to be slightly more honest about your position when it comes to negative gearing. Now, like any reasonable person, I think once we start getting into the taxpayer financing of 3, 4, 5 and more homes, we're in trouble. Should the tax system be able to help you with the investment property and maybe a second investment property? Sure. Because if that's the way that you're able to accumulate wealth so that at a point later in life you're able to pull all of that money, pay off your existing house, have money for your retirement, or more importantly, have money for when you start to need things like aged care, I don't have a problem. But you notice that none of the conversation about negative gearing is about that. It's just about saying the whole thing is just a dirty way of sending money to already rich people. Well, if that's the logic, they should have a look in the mirror before they try to have a go at everyone else. But would that surprise you that they don't have many of those in the Greens party room? Now, as we know, Jim Chalmers likes to tell you that the overall economy in Australia, fantastic, great, thanks to me, I'm the guy, gold star, I worked for the world's best treasurer, I'll be the world's best treasurer. And particularly one of the ways that they do this is by talking about the unemployment numbers, which, yes, are low, and they often talk about the fact that because it has a 3 in front of it, everything is awesome. It's a talking point that most governments roll out, and even their supporters from time to time will roll out, as I did in relation to the previous government. But there's a detail that's different about this government that I want to get to in a second. But here he is, the Treasurer, talking about employment numbers.
More than 700,000 jobs created under the Albanese Labor government. That is far and away a record for a first-term government of any political persuasion.
Good spin, right? Remember last night I spoke about the detail about there's a whole bunch of people who work in and around the machine of talking about politics, and they just want to keep it all up here at the basic level. If you can win the BS fight of the day, then you've won the politics. They believe the Australian public is too distracted or too stupid or doesn't remember what happened before, hence what I mentioned before about Bill Shorten's policies that were rejected are now the law of the land. But just in December, the last numbers that we had for the last month when it came to the economy and employment, well, they tell us the real story of what's going on. There were 106,000 people who lost a full-time job in the last month of the year. Now, this was covered up by the 41,000 people who got part-time jobs, but as we told you recently, the total number of people who were buying things from the shops in December is $800 million down on the previous year. So the whole idea that you need to have extra staff to deal with the Christmas surge, well, it didn't quite happen. And that in part is because people didn't turn up for the sales because they were buying things on the internet. But since this year has started, there have been plenty of job losses. Now, I don't know what's going to happen when the numbers come out in a couple of weeks, but remember the Godfrey's vacuum cleaner chain, 200 jobs will go. There's a packaging company that is today announcing about 2,000 jobs are going to go. That's Amcor. And then I'm sad to say bow repairs, which I didn't know anything about their business. I assumed that because people need brand new tyres all the time, they'd be sitting pretty. But apparently 100 stores are about to go and 700 jobs will go as the tyre retailer folds. And add to this the reality on the ground that sees companies like Godfrey's, Amcor and Bow Repairs all shed jobs. We now hear about the company directors who expect that to be more of the rule than the exception to the rule as the year rolls on. But if you ask Chalmers, Labor or any one of their media boosters,
everything is awesome. Everything is cool when you're part of a team. Everything is awesome when we live in our dream.
now, let's talk about a fake fight. Now, whenever remember Labor pretends to fight with the Greens, we all laugh because we know they're in lockstep anyway. And we're all now supposed to believe that there's a giant fight that's brewing between two Labor governments, one being a state Labor government and one being a federal Labor government. Now, of course, all bar Tasmania, and we'll all see what happens there recently in the next little while, they're all Labor governments everywhere. So they all pretend to fight about money, but in the end, they all have each other's back. That's the Labor way, remember? Well, the Herald Sun reports that there is one of the many funding agreements that get announced at things like those national cabinet things. Well, this most recent one looks like it may well have fallen apart, with special contributions, which were supposed to be 13.2, are now down to $11 billion. So Tim Pallas, the Treasurer in Victoria, decided to write, and I quote, an explosive letter. And it has been obtained by the Herald Sun. It was sent on Wednesday. Mr Pallas questioned the Commonwealth's plans to cut the contributions to states and territories from 13.2 to $11 billion over the next 5 years. And this is why I'm talking about it tonight. Here's the quote. "We do not care who's in Canberra. We expect whoever's in Canberra to do the right thing by Victorians. And when they're not doing it, we'll call it out." Really, Treasurer? So if this is going to be a reduction in the amount of money that the Victorian government's going to get over the next 5 years, will you be using taxpayer funds to campaign against the federal government like you did in 2019, when you, the Treasurer, Daniel Andrews, the Premier, put ads on TV, radio and even on the sideboards of the MCG? Now, I would have thought the MCG wouldn't take political advertising, but, you know, we don't want to offend the dear leader. So there it was. Canberra, Victoria, just want our fair share. A not so subtle message in favour of one-sided politics. It didn't work in 2019, but let's see if in 2025 the Victorian government will take out any ads whatsoever against the Labor federal government. Of course not. So you can whistle Dixie and carry on and pretend that there's a fight between the Victorian and federal governments. It's not, it's rubbish. Meantime, something I have talked a lot about, again, as we follow the data, don't give you the diatribe, right? Try to follow the data, and there's a lot of data around today, so my head's sort of ringing a little bit from all of this. But there's an issue when it comes to assault in Australia. I think that anyone who receives a punch from somebody that they don't know, completely innocently, well, that'll change your life forever. If you're the victim of an assault, it changes you forever. It makes you slightly more cautious, and I say this as somebody who thankfully has never been a victim of assault, but you would live in fear of that level of attack, right? And we know that there are fights that happen all day, every day, daytime, nighttime, or wherever. We all see the footage all the time. But the Australian Bureau of Statistics, and by the way, we love mentioning the ABS, and I'm sure that they love that we're the ones that actually mention them here. But they put out a report today that kind of backs up where we have been talking, which is the number of victims of assaults, the number of offenders as well. Apparently now, the highest number of offenders has been recorded in the past financial year, and it's the highest in 15 years. Police proceeding against 91,000 offenders for acts intending to cause injury in 1 year. 91,000 people around the country were the aggressors. Now, William Milne, who's the head of crime and justice statistics, is quoted in the release from the ABS today. This was the highest number recorded in 15 years since this report began, and the most significant of these offenders were proceeded against for assault. Now, I think in many ways that there are too many people who try to pretend that assault is just part of a big city. I think it's a sign of an indecent society, to be very honest with you. And we know youth crime is a particular issue. In fact, nationally, when it comes to youth crime, there were 48,000 offenders that were aged between 10 and 17 that were proceeded against by police. That's up by 2,800 people in just 1 year across the entire country. Now, specifically in Queensland, where we know that youth crime is a problem and should be a state election issue, but they'll change the subject, BS, and get a lot of media support for it because remember the form. Most of the people who cover Queensland politics end up working for the Labor Party, certainly when it comes to television. There were 10,878 offenders between just 10 and 17 years old in Queensland in that financial year last year of 22-23, an increase of 6% from the previous year. Youth offended proceedings by police comprised 13%. 13% of all of the offenders that were prosecuted by police in Queensland. Yet there are plenty of people on Twitter and in the media, remember the ones that turned around and literally used examples from this program as examples of it all being a media beat-up. Well, in fact, that was literally what a Labor MP had to say. His name was Don Brown. This Labor MP turned around and referred to the whole thing as, quote, a media beat-up. Please remember this stuff when there's a Queensland election. Don't fall for the spin, the BS, the great ads, all the rest of it. They're great at politics, the Queensland government. But they're terrible at running a state and they're terrible about taking care of its population, let alone the health system on top of it. What is that? Such a huge number of youth offenders around the country, such a massive increase in the number of people being held accountable for assaults because those assaults are taking place. But, stable, nothing to see here. Crime's a right-wing invention. Now, remember the Optus outage from last year. Thankfully, it cost the hapless CEO her job. But the company in and of itself and many of the people around its top echelons think that there was a way of buying off a headline that didn't really cost the business much money. I'll explain that in a second. But remember when Optus went down for about a day and there were plenty of small businesses in particular who just lost the internet completely, which meant they basically couldn't operate.
It is that horrible sense of, wow, it's a really bad day.
At the end of the day, I still have to pay for my service. I'm not going to get a discount on top of it.
It never reached to us. They never sent any message saying what's the reason.
It's just not good enough.
As he was presumably changing phone plans. Now, of course, Optus, for its part, well, it did sorry eventually on its website. And it was able to buy off much of the media in terms of the distraction game by pretending they were doing something to recognise how sorry they were. From the ABC, Optus offers customers 200 gig of free data as compensation for the nationwide outage. Well, our mate, Trevor Long, writing in his website, but saying on all the shows here, his website EFTM, he said that this was garbage. Why? Because in Australia, the average mobile data use is only 15 gig a month. So thanks for the 200, I don't need most of it. So they were offering something they knew the customer wouldn't end up using. So, as he said, it was a joke. And today we learned via the Telecommunications Industry Ombudsman that Trevor and I were right, that the PR team over at Optus who think they've got it all sewn up, but just offer some free data because most of them won't use it anyway. The Telecommunications Industry Ombudsman has said that it wasn't enough because it didn't actually match the businesses and the cost to the businesses. Instead, it just was an offer for data that you didn't need. Now, I know I'm a bit Robinson Crusoe on this issue, but there are problems with the Bureau of Meteorology in Australia. Now, I am not suggesting shutting down, selling it off, or don't believe the weather forecast, but I am saying that we every now and then have to double check when the Bureau says things like this and it becomes news and 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 news, as it was leading into summer.
We're looking at an elevated risk for heat waves and prolonged sort of heat spells.
Not quite what happened. In fact, an awful lot of rain, and despite the fact that we were supposed to have more bushfires and all the rest of it, and get ready, it's Black Summer 2.0, and the Prime Minister made sure that he was available just in case there was a bushfire somewhere so we could show he was so different than the former Prime Minister. Well, guess what happened? It rained an awful lot. And in fact, in New South Wales and Sydney, Warragamba Dam, they're number one, I'll get to in a second, but overall, 93% full are the dams in New South Wales, 97% full is the dam to the west of Sydney that is its main water supply, the Warragamba Dam. But this was the heatwave summer with more bushfires and less rain. Meantime, other people from the Bureau have come out and have said, among other things in the past 24 hours, that there is wild extremes in the weather. And why? All of that is, of course, to do with climate change, and all of that is to do with coal and gas. Now, again, I'm not pretending that humans do not have an effect on the planet, and 8 million of us are going to end up at some point in time buggering around with the atmosphere. But if you think Australia is the climate change problem, can you have a look at this from the Union of Concerned Scientists? Australia is 1% of the climate problem, and our weather is connected to the climate problem. We are 1% of the problem. China, 30% of the problem. The rest of the third world, 27%. What about India? What about Russia? So I love that. Let's get rid of coal and gas in Australia because it is affecting the weather in Australia. When the country that is polluting more than any country in the world, that is allowed to double its pollution every year till 2030 before it even starts getting measured, is the same country that the Green Movement says we have to buy our renewable technologies from, that, by the way, are made by slave labour in the Uyghurs, then guess who's winning all day, every day? Useful idiots in this country helping China, that pollute the world and send products to the rest of the world that are made by slave labour. Fair dinkum. Pull the other one. It plays Jingle Bells. Quick break. Back with more. Lots to talk about tonight. We will get to in a moment. Looking forward to my mate Linda Scott and my lovely friend, the Persian princess, none other than Rita Panahi. She's on the telly too. Nigel Farage a little bit later. Just getting started. Ladies' Night is next. Welcome back. Plenty more to fire up here with, and what a lovely crew to do it with. Ladies' Night, and it's the princesses everywhere. We love to see them, the Queen of Local Government, see how it works there. Linda Scott representing them in Canberra right now, otherwise City of Sydney Council, and the Persian Princess via Texas. The Instagram feed you must all see. The Queen of the Outsiders, my dear friend, the lady who can do no wrong. Is that enough of a butter up? Hello, Rita.
It is, because I'm not happy sharing the princess label. I thought that was just for us. And now you're just using it willy-nilly. Every girl who walks into the studio gets it.
Yeah, that's it. I was caught cheating in front of you.
Don't do it in front of me.
No,
don't do it in front of me.
Don't do time in front. Geez, imagine if that's the punishment. Imagine what happens behind. All right, now let's get to this here. So the negative gearing changes potentially that are going to happen here. And I say potentially going to happen because let's not play the game of, oh, they've never said anything and they're going to rule it out. And then they'll try, and then we all know what's going to happen. At some point, there's going to be a pivot here. Linda, do you think this federal government will make any changes whatsoever when it comes to negative gearing? Or can we trust them that they've absolutely learnt the lesson from the shortened defeat in 2019? Oh, yeah, that's right. They've introduced most of those policies anyway.
Well, look, the crossbench here in Canberra has to have something to talk about, don't they? And so they've all been this week, as Parliament has been sitting, talking about negative gearing and other tax changes they'd like to see. And of course, we've even seen former Liberal Premier Dominic Perrottet come out and say that he thinks there should be movement on negative gearing. And of course, we know that this was a policy examined by Scott Morrison and Malcolm Turnbull. So look, this is an idea that has been thrown around. So documents, of course, FOI documents have revealed that they examined this policy. They decided not to do it. But this is an idea that has been thrown around for many, many years. The Prime Minister's been super clear about it. And of course, because he's focused on giving every working Australian a tax cut, and that is a really welcome thing. We know the opposition doesn't want to talk about that, even though, of course,
for the people in Frankston. Wow.
Labor's policy. But this is a tax cut, Paul, for
$14. It does change the world.
13.6 million Australians. 13.6 million Australians are getting a tax cut, and that's a great outcome.
Yeah, but if they're paying off a house, like 41% of the people of Frankston are currently, they have to find an extra $29,000 a year thanks to the elbow dozen of rate rises. But no, don't worry. Don't worry about that. Scott Morrison was apparently looking at the changes in negative gearing. Okay.
They've also had the fastest wage growth under Labor. I could go on and on.
Please. Okay, well, I'll gladly have a stat off at some time. I think I back myself on that one. Now, Rita, again, obviously Labor is trying to stop this one from getting away because the talking point is rather clear. No disrespect to Linda, but I'm not sure she was across just how what exactly Scott Morrison was allegedly looking into in government. So the message is out that this is the way to push back. But we played earlier in the show Chalmers' actual view about negative gearing, that unless there is negative gearing reform, there is no housing policy around all of this, right? So they've already got Shorten's climate policy, Shorten's tax policy, get ready for Shorten's negative gearing policy. How does that go down in the real world?
Well, we saw how it went down when they went to an election with the last time around. And I think this government, this Labor government, is far more radically left than the Shorten team that Australia rejected. They went to the election promising us they were centrist, they were sensible, they weren't these mad ideologues. Remember that front page of the Daily Telegraph? Anthony Albanese saying, I'm not woke, I'm not this. No. He is from Labor's socialist left faction. That is what's driving this party, and we know what's in their DNA. They don't like aspiration. They don't like Australians being independent and self-reliant, and that's what property is. For a lot of people who are not born into wealth, property is a means of building some financial security.
100%.
So they're not reliant on the old age pension. They're not reliant on the taxpayer in retirement. They can take care of themselves. That's something we should be encouraging. And of course, there's the other side to it. If you don't have these policies in place, what happens to the renters? Because you remove those policies, rents will skyrocket. We've seen that previously. We're seeing it right now in places like Victoria, where just the state government taxes are so high through land tax for property investors, and so many property investors are exiting the market. You would think that might be a good thing for property prices, but it's not. It's actually just driving up rents. And it's so absurd and economically illiterate to be upset about negative gearing and the fact that someone investing in property can claim the interest they pay on their loan. You can go and set up a margin lending facility and buy a bundle of shares and claim the interest of that. So why should it be allowed for one class of investment and not another? But of course, they just rely on people acting on the politics of envy and backing something that is patently stupid because they think maybe they'll be better off.
Look, I don't want to be mean here, but Ross Greenwood, you might have to move over a little bit here. Some financial advice from Rita Panahi. And of course, her advice is general in nature. Please speak to a private broker before following your...
Get the prospectus.
But get the prospectus. What do they always used to say? Choice, shop around. Now, also, let's talk about big business, because big business was, falling over itself to think that they could get in with the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister played them all for mugs, particularly in the lead up to that job summit. Remember all those big corporate CEOs that were flying around on Toto 1? Well, they are now realising what the reality of the government is, the best part of 18 months and into its second year as the government, when they introduce things like jail terms for contraventions of the Industrial Relations Act, which are currently being discussed, and major consequences for the right to contact. Here's business bitching and moaning about the team they cheered into power.
So there's a process issue here, which has really played out this week, where you've seen people raising legitimate concerns about how this type of change operates in practice. What happens if you're in WA sending an email after 2 p.m, for example?
Does it also...
Now, Rita, we've talked about this before, right? And it's a long time ago. But governments literally, when we were having the same-sex marriage debate, was at the same time there was a conversation about dropping the corporate tax cut rate, right? They put more effort into the same-sex marriage debate, into the voice debate, than they did their own corporate tax, right? So all of these people that just want to be near the winner but don't understand what the consequence of the winner being whom the winner is, well, they can go jump as far as I'm concerned. They can understand that sitting around and literally clapping the Prime Minister with his carbon targets one day is used as sort of tacit approval for the right not to contact the next.
I tell you, this policy, this law may be absurd, but I have very little sympathy for the big end of town, small business operators, medium business operators. Yeah, I feel very sorry for more legislation and more red tape they have to deal with. But the big end of town, I mean, they have completely lost sight of what their focus is. The focus is taking care of their shareholders primarily, taking care of their staff and other key stakeholders. It's not getting involved in divisive political and social issues like The Voice. And we saw with The Voice something that the overwhelming majority of Australians rejected. Every big bank backed it. We had the likes of Woolworths backing it. So many big corporates, sporting bodies, all got behind that. Why? How could they possibly justify that? How was that in the interest of their staff members, of their shareholders, of their customers? And now you can see being distracted by things that they have no business engaging in actually comes at a cost, because they need to be focusing on lobbying government about issues that actually affect the running of their business. I mean, novel idea. That would be nice to see.
Now, Linda, I could hear the scoffs coming from wherever you were last night.
Scoffs? How dare she?
No, well, exactly, scoffing, rolling of eyes, tisking, if you will, because the alternative Prime Minister took on one of the queens of the left over there on Channel 2. Roll the tape. No, I'll act it out for you in a second, but if we can have it, we don't. All right, let's go.
Do you feel also that your political momentum is slipping away?
I just think it's such an ABC perspective, if I might say. All the culture that's so far left within the ABC just seems to permeate through many questions when you go on to a program like this.
Let me ask why you would characterise it in those terms. If we look at the situation, there was widespread agreement.
I think they're the only journalist that's putting that analysis there, apart from The Guardian, apart from some of the other left-wing online publications.
Now, I love it, but Linda, why do you find it offensive and an attack on the independence of the of the public broadcaster that does so much every day?
Look, I watched that interview this morning and it genuinely was really interesting and an insight, I think, into Peter Dutton. It was really remarkable to me that he spent really the majority of the interview attacking Sarah Ferguson and attacking her credibility as a journalist.
Response is attack.
You know, really, of course, his job is to hold the government to account, and he spent more time talking about Sarah Ferguson and the ABC than actually talking about his own policies, the government of the day, or what they were doing, or anything actually about the public interest. It was a really bizarre interview, and of course this comes off the back of his other attacks on journalists. Of course, he's attacked the former Guardian's Catherine Murphy, and then he's attacked other Canberra's press gallery.
The one who's walking for Albo. The one who's working for Albo. The one who's working for Albo. Bad example, Fiona. Bad example.
Paul Murray and I, you know, barely agree on a thing. But we can sit here week after week and have great, civil, lovely debate, actually, about lots of really important issues.
Correct.
And that is what the alternative leader, possibly, of this nation, Peter Dutton, should be able to do. He should be able to turn up and instead of attacking someone personally, I don't think
He can't say BS.
Paul Murray
you could see in his head what he wanted to say was,
what he should do is argue
BS.
the merits of his case.
But he couldn't say it. Instead he said, that's such an ABC question.
What he couldn't answer was a question about whether or not he supported the government's policy. He couldn't answer that simple question. And of course, we know now that he said that he will support Labor's tax policy. But for minutes and minutes of that primetime ABC interview, he simply attacked Sarah Ferguson rather than answer that question. I think that for Australians was a really revealing insight into the kind of person that he is.
Yeah. Did you think, Linda?
The kind of person he is someone who's thoroughly fed up with the bias of the ABC, like most of us who pay taxes for the ABC, who completely ignore their charter, every single day. Calling that an attack, I think, is hyperbole or hyperbole, as Julia Gillard would call it. I mean, that was not an attack. That was just certainly just holding, and it's a tactic we've seen recently. If you want, I mean, I know this is going to trigger Fiona, Ron DeSantis. Ron DeSantis
Linda,
is
not Fiona.
absolutely expert.
Fiona is a Liberal former MP. That is not me.
I keep calling.
You've still got holiday brain.
I am so sorry. I've done it twice.
Back in Texas.
I'm in Texas. I am in Texas. I've done. What, Paul?
I won't take it as a personal attack, Rita. Don't worry.
It was not a
She's going to give
personal
me a
attack.
lashing now.
It was not a personal.
What have I done wrong now?
I know. We shouldn't have said it was 3 times. I owned up to twice. Just let's move on. But it's something Ron DeSantis does beautifully. When the media come at him with an obviously biased narrative where they're not actually interested in the issues, when they're not actually interested in finding out what's happening, then you throw that back at them. And I think Conservative voters actually want to see that. Yes, the ABC, Guardian, Crikey crowd will be triggered by it, but that's not who Peter Dutton needs. He doesn't need people who are never going to vote for him. He needs people who have walked away from the Liberal Party, people who at the last couple of elections have walked away to get interested again.
Good point. All right, winners and losers of the week. Linda, so, who stands out for you as the winner or loser of the week?
Look, obviously the Labor government here are the winners with their tax cuts for 13.6 million Australians. But the loser of the week is, unfortunately, Clover Moore and my own council, the City of Sydney. We're coming up to Lunar New Year, big global city. And we have found out from my local parents in the city, they've cut back on the bilingual, beautiful library sessions. So this is where parents come into our libraries, they sit around and read books in multiple languages. And we used to have weekly sessions down in our beautiful Darling Square library, and they've cut them back to monthly. So I've had this huge group of parents complaining, who would cut library literacy programs? What on earth? We're a global city. Hopefully we can get this reinstated and have our beautiful children back in our libraries learning more than one language as we approach Lunar New Year here in Australia.
That's it. Well, maybe Lunar New Year needs a rebrand, a few more rainbows, and she'll throw more money at it. Rita, super fast. Who's your winner? Who's your loser?
Well, loser's got to be Stephen Miles. I mean, that was just the most bizarre performance I have seen from a politician. If that's not a commercial for the Liberal Party for the upcoming state election, they're crazy. And the winner, who should we give the winner to?
You and
I'm
me,
going to
'cause we're
say
back
Prince
together.
Charles or King Charles. King Charles and you and I, but there's some friction between us, let's face it. You've got some ground to make up. You've upset me tonight.
Typical.
And
Blokes always on
we'll
the
see
back
what...
foot. We'll fight back. I'll fight back.
Wow.
You know. It's all right. Dinners, flowers, chocolates, it's all on its way.
Oh.
Thank you very much, Rita.
And tomorrow night, who's on? 7 p.m. Don't forget that.
Oh, don't forget,
Promo.
Rita Panahy, 7 o'clock tomorrow, the best show on Sky News. Is that better? Am I working my way back ever so slightly? Call you after to say sorry really properly. Thank you, Linda. Thank you, Rita. I'm on my way back. We'll get there. The man who had to hear me trying to suck up to the beautiful Persian princess is none other than Nigel Farage. He's straight after the break. He too will apologise to Rita on my behalf. Nigel Farage, host on GB News and maybe a big player of the upcoming UK election. He joins us now from London, as he does each and every week. Great man, lovely to see you.
Good to see you.
Now, let's talk about, we'll get to King Charles in a second, but Joe Biden, I mean, his supporters are trying to pretend that it's Donald Trump who's got the issues when it comes to being cognitive, his cognitive issues. Well, can we play this grab of the president who kind of doesn't know what France is?
Right after I was elected, I went to what they call a G7 meeting, all the NATO leaders. And I sat down and I said, America's back. And Mitterrand from France looked at me and said, you know, why, how long are you back for?
Oh, Nigel.
Oh dear, oh dear. Oh dear, oh dear. Well, to begin, G7 is not NATO, so he got that bit wrong. He got the country wrong, and President Mitterrand died in 1996. And there've been other examples this week, and you know everyone sort of treats this with kid gloves. Let's just say it, shall we? Outright, he clearly has senile dementia. He is wholly unfit to be leader of the free world. And the real question is, when do the Democrats ditch him? They cannot go on into a general election with this man in this steep decline.
And it wasn't his only scenario. Again, earlier this week, bouncing around all over the place, taking too long to get where he needs to go. Now, obviously, they do something to him every now and then to wind him up to perform in a speech for 10, 20 minutes. They sell the ads around him, but when the reality of him, that's the guy who's sitting in the office, right? The guy giving speeches is not the guy sitting in the office. The guy who's kind of getting in and going, that's the guy making the decisions. And even if Donald Trump fluffs a word here or takes a little too long sometimes publicly, we all know that if he's going to be sitting in an office, it's going to be boom, 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 boom. He always has the sound effects for it as well.
Wow. Well, you know, I mean, I've been in that office. I've been in the Oval Office with Trump when he was president. And believe you me, he made the decisions. And whether the staff liked it or not, he made the decisions. Joe Biden's not making any decisions. It's basically Obama's old guys that are still around, that are running the White House and are running America. And in some ways, it suits them to keep Biden there as their puppet because they can get on and do whatever deals they want. But look, you know, July is going to be the convention for the Democrat Party. I simply cannot believe this man will be allowed to run, but maybe I'm wrong.
Let's get back to the UK. King Charles, we got the news and I saw it rolling out live in your show a couple of days ago, and it was quite grave in its language. The idea that we even got it at all seemed to be a suggestion about how serious things are. But then we saw him out of hospital a couple of days later, and obviously none of us are doctors to be able to work out what's going on. They've been pretty quiet about what is going on. But they clearly wanted to show him being seen as a bloke who might have some sort of terrible diagnosis, but it's not a scenario where he's at death's door. But of course, Harry's decision to fly over immediately made it seem like a death's door situation.
Yeah, I mean, look, you know, the cancer diagnosis, it used to be 1 in 3 people at some point in their lifetimes would get the diagnosis. I've had it myself many, many years ago, thank goodness. It's now more like 1 in 2, Paul. So it's not as if this is an unusual diagnosis or disease. We don't know the severity of it. Rishi Sunak hinted that it had been caught early, maybe betrayed a little bit of a confidential conversation. But no, Harry made it look like an emergency, turned it into a real drama by getting on the first flight he possibly could, then being granted a meeting of just half an hour, but no meeting with the Queen, no meeting with his brother, no meeting with his sister-in-law, and within 24 hours, having stayed in a London hotel. Think about that. Yeah. Think how many spare rooms there are at Buckingham Palace, right? Yeah. And he stays in a London hotel and heads back. But you see, here's the point. A lot of people thought, Harry's coming. This could be the rapprochement. But for the Queen or his brother to ever want to see him again or talk to him, he has to apologise for the disgusting things he wrote about them in that book Spare. He sold out his family for money. They're not going to forgive him, and clearly the King's not going to forgive him. He has to apologise in full for what he's done. He shows no signs.
Now, forgive me, I've got a hard out in about a minute here, Talking TV, you know what that means. But apparently there's a bunch of people who are crossing into the country illegally and then pretending that they're Christians when clearly they're not.
The Archbishop of Canterbury is an absolute washout, Marxist washout. Since he became the Archbishop, church attendances have fallen by 15%. And yet, there are now an untold number of people, young Muslim men coming in from Syria, Iraq, Iran, who suddenly, miraculously, convert to Christianity, and then Bob's your uncle, they can stay in the country and they're granted asylum. The whole thing is a joke. And it happened the other day with a guy that threw horrible alkali substance over a woman and 2 children, was allowed to stay in the country because he claimed he was a Christian. It's bad. We've got to deal with it.
Yeah, bloody oath. Look at that, right to the second. It's like you've got a TV show, which, of course, you can see online, on YouTube, in the UK and on Flash. Thank you so much, Nigel. We'll see you again next week for a longer chat. All right, quick break, back with more as we finish up our week, but get ready for the late debate. They are ready to go in 4 from now. Have a great weekend. Go Yankees, and here's the late debate.